I do have a question for you though, and something that I've been working on a bit myself lately is how did you approach working on the end-to-end, the user experience and user journey? Because that seems like a big part of this exam and figuring out the story to tell.
So that is an area I wanted to cover in. So
Okay, we can wait.
Yeah, I mean it's okay. I can give you some tips, but so there's two sessions that I'm planning to cover with you guys. One is the exam strategy and prep strategy, and the other one is the artifact creation, specifically how to balance the detail versus I want to say perspectives. I found that there was a balance that worked for me in order to tell the story. So the two sort of domain areas are sort of intrinsically linked, but I'll deal with them separately, and then we can sort of cross-pollinate. But storytelling's tricky.
Yep.
And the artifacts help to tell the story. So if you're struggling to tell the story using the artifacts that you've got, chances are that you possibly need to look at your artifacts and how you need to adapt them to help you. Because ultimately, when you don't want to have to think when you are trying to present. I think Vinay said it a couple of times before, but you've got to get to a point where there are certain aspects of your solution that you don't have to think about and that you can reel off quite openly or talk about dynamically on the fly. Okay, the artifacts themselves should be of a sufficient density, information density, and arrangement that allows you a logical flow through them that helps that storytelling. So I think Yanis Bott also posted an article. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, he called it Salesforce-centric system architecture. We post it in the chat here, where he talked about how he arranges system architecture diagrams to ensure that he's included all the different aspects. Okay. Now, when it comes to storytelling, I think from end to end, as your question was about end to end, I think you've got to think about it in layers. So if you consider your presentation and your artifacts, your deck of artifacts to be the story itself, you would start with an introduction, and your first sort of aspect would probably be a very, very high level view. So that's your business overview. And then you would look at the next level down, which is probably the most impacted layer, or most fundamental layer, if you like, that if you got any one of the other aspects wrong, could be compromised, which would be your licenses. And that's after risks and assumptions, which I would say form the introduction. So you've gone down a level a little bit there, and you're starting to talk about, okay, now we know the environment we're in. Let's talk about the people who are going to be using the system and that are going to be impacted by what we're going to propose next. So that's starting to tell the story, right? That's starting to say, describe the environment. Now let's talk about who's part of that environment and then we talk about the what, which is the landscape diagram. That's where Yanis's article can come into play, and I'll talk about in another session the balance between density and simplification. But what you then need to work out with your landscape diagram is how do you tell the story with that landscape diagram, bearing in mind that you've just talked about who the users are, right? So you still got to talk about it in process terms, but it's a high level view of the systems. I made this mistake way back when, and we're still making the mistake about 3/4 of the way through my my journey. And even today, sometimes I fall into the trap of mixing up the detail with the context. But you move around your diagram in a way, and this depends on how you lay out your diagram, but you move around your diagram in a way that means that you can talk about what you're proposing, but still hit the domains that are needed for the system architecture part of the exam. So if you think about it systematically, you need to cover the core platform, then you might cover document management. Or actually, that's not true. I normally do that last, but you might do the core platform. Then you might talk about the communities, specifically in the context of the users who you just introduced in the previous slide, right? So the user groups. So you've already talked about the user groups. Now you jump in to say, okay, well, Salesforce is the main proponent of the landscape. My users, this type of user, will be interacting with the platform through this mechanism, whether that be a community or mobile or whatever. So you're introducing mobile at that point. You can also, at that point, talk about a high-level justification for your mobile strategy, right? So that's the introduction of that part of the system architecture exam. Then you'll talk about a different user group. It might be resellers, it might be introducers, it might be distributors, it might be some other group. But stay with the community aspect there, because you're already talking about the community aspect. Okay, so you're continuing to talk about how external users interact with the platform. Then you can move on to internal users and more detail around the core platform. And then I tend to go on to integration next. So, we've talked about how users interact with the platform. Now we're going to talk about how additional services and third-party services are integrated into the process, specifically with the platform. And then I'll go on to, okay, well, now we've talked about external, we've talked about the core platform, we've talked about third-party solutions and services. I'll now talk about back office. So you can see how there's a logical sequence to it that touches all the different aspects around the core platform. That helps, based on how you arrange the systems, to tell the story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually a really good explanation. I've never heard it explained that way before, and it's very helpful.
Yeah. So now we talked about the what. So what does it look like? We can then jump into the detail of what the data model looks like under the hood. So now, if you think about it, now we're talking about, rather than systems, we're talking about how the individual data entities play into the same process that you've just gone through. So it's again, you're moving down into a level of one level lower of granularity. So you're not disconnected from the previous explanation, and that's the key to the telling the story. Now, in the data model, again, you want to arrange your entities in a way that allows you to logically flow through the process. And that might not be obvious at first. I tend to put the customer at the middle. I think and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail in other areas, but I use the analogy of a flower when I arrange my data model, where you've got domain areas representing the petals, but they all sort of branch off from a single central customer representation. So again, by doing it that way, you know that there's an area off to the top left, or there's an area to the bottom that all handles the same domain and potentially the same process. So it's easy to start at the center, go out and talk about one particular process and the entities that relate to that particular process, then come back and maybe go out to another area of the data model, but keep them all sort of together and grouped, but in chunks around a central sort of linchpin, which is the customer. So again, depending on the way you organize it, it helps you to sort of talk through a logical progression around your data model, again, that's aligned to the process, right? I mean, there's a very purist model. In reality, there are exceptions to that where you have to sort of not talk about one specific entity because it comes into another process. So it can be, you know, it doesn't have to be as structured as that, but you get the sort of gist that there's a logical approach to move around the diagram, and that helps with the storytelling. Then the next section is, okay, so now that you've talked about the landscape, you've gone into a little bit of detail around how the entities are related to each other in relation to the business process. You can now go into the mechanics of the business process and how the flow through the business process uses the features of the platform. So this is the glue part, if you like. This is where it all comes together, and you can really talk about a process. Now, unfortunately, the size of this section in a presentation is so significant that there isn't really an easy way to do it other than to go point by point in a linear fashion through the through the document itself and hit each requirement on the way. But what helps to be able to tell the story through this is two things, I believe. One is understanding the meta model. So I've forgotten what the other term is. I want to say mind map, but that's not the right word.
Journey map?
No, it's a mental model, I guess I'll call it. So I've got an example of this on a few occasions written down on paper. So it doesn't become an artifact, but if you, I do believe that if you practice doing this in your mocks, eventually it will become second nature as you're reading through the scenario, that you form this mental model of the process and how the interactions work between the various parties and what they're actually dealing with. It's not a linear process. It's more of a like a map.
So I started doing what I call journey mapping, like showing the user and what they're doing. Like maybe they click something and then something else happens, and then another user does something. And I'm just doing, like, I'm really drawing it out now. And I was thinking, okay, if I keep doing this as I practice, it would become second nature. So I really don't have to draw it out. Maybe I'd scribble down a few notes, but it will just become, like you said, you'll start thinking about it in that way, which will help tell the story, and then you fill in all the details.
Yeah, that's right. And it's easy then. You'll have your notes with you during the presentation. It's
Exactly.
very
Yeah.
easy for you to be able to refer to that mental model, either if you've written it down or if you sort of formulated it in your head, to be able to, as you talk through the process, talk about how these parties interact with each other at the same time, which again gives that story element to it. So yeah, I would definitely recommend carrying on and practicing that, drawing out the mental models as part of your mock scenarios.
Some quick,
and then sorry, go.
Quick question. So I totally see the value in doing that. And as we are often under time pressure doing the mocks, if we start doing this exercise, that's going to add up to our total time. So I suppose the total value is still there, even if we go over the allocated time because of that, but because we'll be gradually getting faster and faster, we shouldn't worry too much about being slow initially, right?
Initially, correct. Yeah, absolutely. That.
Yep.
Absolutely.
That's why I will work scenarios very thoroughly so that I could get the concepts and I see the patterns, so that then when I see something new, I can apply that pattern and concept and it becomes quicker for me. Because if you don't do that at first, then you're not going to get it solidified. And then it's just going to keep being difficult. You're never going to really progress. So yeah, I always say, don't worry about the time at first. Just really worry about understanding the concepts and being able to see what's going on more than anything.
That's right. It's recognition. You're reading through a scenario, and guaranteed, whether you realize it or not, you are forming a mental model. If you're not, then you need to be drawing out a mental model to get into that practice.
Yep, exactly. Yep, and it's more about getting yourself into that habit so that then you don't have to draw it out as much.
Yeah.
Hey, Sam, how to avoid duplication of that same mental model explanation when we are presenting data model, system landscape, and also reading the solution out in the end? We tend to duplicate that scenario and probably spend more time or waste time, right? That I've been going through right now, and I see that I'm duplicating that entire scenario as part of the data model first, then the system landscape, then role hierarchy, and losing a lot of time. How do you, any suggestions on that, avoiding duplication?
Yeah, so I sort of go back to what I was saying before, which is think about the overall story. Okay, and remind yourself when you're going into a particular section, what is it which part of the story you're actually talking about here? So for example, if you start talking about too much process in the system landscape section, you've probably forgotten that actually the intent of the system landscape is to identify the main components of the landscape and what they are there for, and why, right? It's not a process walkthrough. The process gives a little context, but that isn't what it's for, right? And it's a high level as well. So if you find that you're going into details of integration flows at that point, you're going to duplicate yourself. What you say then when you walk through your business process, and you refer to the integrations then as well. So it takes some discipline, some practice, but try and sort of picture the story from high level down to a granular level, where the granular level is only at the business process requirements and beyond. And at the system landscape level, you're talking about the high level components with an explanation of the user, for example. It's not going to be so it's not necessarily going to be the process that you talk about during the system landscape. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Makes some very good points. Thank you. I just need to practice, I guess, limiting myself to the context of that artifact. Yeah.
Sometimes when I was doing this, I sort of, you've got like an inner voice that both tells you what to do next and what you need to say, but also is thinking ahead and should you have done this? You know, it's both the positive and the negative, you know, self-doubt sort of voice that comes in there. The positive one should be saying, you know, you should be listening to the voice that says, that's enough, I will cover this later.
Yeah.
The sort of self-critical voice is the one that would be saying to you, have you provided enough detail? Have you mentioned this? Have you mentioned that? Right? And you need to balance the two off against each other. I'm coming to that. Don't distract me, you know?
Yep. Good points.
So then we're sort of moving into reporting and you've got data migration, reporting, accessibility, and visibility. And I would see those as ancillary from a storytelling perspective to the business process section. Okay, and the solution architecture section of the exam, mainly because it's hard to tell a story in those areas. So you just have to hit the requirements one by one. But given that you've understood where they fit in the process, you can frame the sort of summary of the requirement that still gives a natural language to it. So you might say, in order for the senior execs to build a picture of the overall service performance of the agents, I'm going to use a standard Salesforce dashboard that reports on case closure, time to closure. Do you see what I mean? So you're still framing it in the context of specific users and what they need, but it's not a process at that point. You're just hitting each requirement as it is, you know, as it's written, basically, and proposing the solution. So at that point, it's very difficult to continue the story. And then you move lastly into the project delivery and life cycle. And again, I don't think that there's a story to this, but at a macro level, you sort of dealt with all the technicalities of the process. You're now talking about people and how they organize themselves, and put yourself in the shoes of either a CTO or a or a delivery manager, or a security infosec person, and talk about it in the context of them and what they would need. Does that help? Does that sort of give you an idea of how you might be able to tell a story with the end-to-end?
So storytelling, Sam, those are really good points. But so if I'm covering the data model and system landscape, I need to think like an implementer or a technical lead or a leader. Whereas if I'm telling the journeys or those process requirements, I need to think like actual user and share the story. Is that correct understanding?
I would agree with this second point you made, that yeah, as you're going through the business process requirements, you need to be considering how that works for an end user to help you tell the story. At a landscape level, I'd be thinking CTO.
Awesome point. Thank you. That's
yeah.
good.
For the data model, I'd be thinking probably InfoSec, information security, or a data architect or something like that. I mean, think, it goes without saying it's data architecture, but it's more information security. So how is the information structured? How is it related to each other? How is it secured? How is it performant? And where does it flow from and to? Because ultimately, as an infosec person, I'd want to make sure that it's the movement is governed, that it's we're not missing any relationships that impact our downstream processes and so on.
Sam, I have some detailed questions on this overall outline you gave. The outline itself is something I follow. So on the system landscape, if you go by user, let's say after external users, you cover internal user. And the internal user, of course, can use a mobile app, so you can cover that.
Yeah.
I just wonder, when they log into mobile app, they are using OAuth flow, user agent flow on top of single sign. So there, should I go jump into the single sign-on corner of my diagram and point out I'm recommending something like Okta and do that? Or should I go around the diagram and then when I get to single sign-on, I introduce that?
It's a good question. I'm trying to remember what I did. I think I talked about the identity side of things after I'd finished talking about all the users.
Gotcha.
Because you can always mention the identity part, but at a very brief level, and then come back to the identity side of things after you've gone through all the users as a more holistic view of anything you've missed or anything you intended. So, for example, there's probably more to single sign-on that you want to cover than just saying that the user agent flow will invoke the SP initiated single sign-on flow, as part of a layered OAuth process, right?
Okay.
So then you might go into the SP initiated flow for internal users where they're accessing the Salesforce platform directly, not in a mobile context, separately to that.
Okay, so now the overall timing of the system landscape part, I found that at one presentation, when I tried, Jitendra told me, try to present that in 2 minutes, see what I can do that. So I can do that. But then in another presentation, when I did not try intentionally shorten the time, I was covering the whole picture and then covering integration, and there's a Canvas app. I cannot resist to cover the Canvas app. When I'm done, 7 to 8 minutes has passed, so I was alarmed by that. What is the right balance between 2 minutes to 7, 8 minutes?
I'm going to say a very consulting answer. It depends.
Okay.
The reason I say that is because it depends how slick you are in the other sections, right?
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
So ultimately, you want to be getting to a point where you've finished your business process somewhere around the I would say 25 to 30 minute mark, because you've still got data migration, reporting, accessibility and visibility, and governance to go through,
Okay.
which is a decent amount to do in 15 minutes anyway, right?
Yeah.
So if you've done your system landscape in or you've got up to your system landscape and you're covering that in 6 to 8 minutes, you're really putting yourself under pressure to get through the sheer volume of what's going to be in the business process section.
Gotcha. It cannot be okay. Probably 4 minutes is enough for system.
Yeah, I would work backwards from the longest pole, basically.
Gotcha. The object model, I have a detailed question over there, and just like you, I put the customer in the center, and then And then I try to cluster the objects based on is this sales or is that service and is this payment. So when I cover the object model, do I need to name every object? Or I say, this is the payment cluster and this there's 3 objects over here and everything is labeled there. Do I really need to say that that's a master detail and this is lookup, or I do not need to do that?
In my opinion, yes.
You do, okay.
If
Gotcha.
you put it on the diagram, you should explain it.
Got you. Okay. Then there's a lot to explain on the data
Yeah.
model. This is a
So
okay.
I asked the question, how can you simplify it so that you still hit it, but in enough detail? And that's the real question, right? You don't have to put every object on your diagram to explain the concept of how the data is managed.
Okay. Okay. So, well, let me ask you a few examples to confirm. So let's say they want a knowledge article to do case deflection. I really do not need to put case article there and knowledge article there. It's cases there. And then when I, in the solution part, I say I use Salesforce knowledge. So the data model is assumed. I really should put knowledge article and the joint and the junction object between article and a case there.
I would put them on because they're a key part of that feature that you're proposing.
Okay.
But you don't need you don't need to put data categories on there. You don't need to put do you see what I mean?
Okay.
You don't need to put channels on there or anything like that. They're not an entity, but you get the idea.
Gotcha. Okay. And in your in review board presentation, when we recommend the apps, do we explain how they work, or we just say a few sentences about them and then move on?
There are some key apps that are important to show how it's not how they work, it's how they are used in the context of the other entities in the model.
Mm.
That makes sense.
Gotcha.
So if you've got a requirement that says I need that we need to generate a document and send it for signature, and it's an agreement for services that have been purchased, then you may have an order object, and you may have some form of representation of a generated document. So it'd be an agreement, right? But that's going to be based on a template that's configured in the system. So you're going to need some form of template object. And then you're going to need some form of recipient object in there as well to relate it to the customer.
Oh,
right?
Explain how it works in the context of the requirement.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. You don't need to go into any more than that, because it picks out the key entities that are part of that feature or part of that process and how they relate to the rest of your model.
Gotcha.
The actual AppExchange app or whatever it is includes a lot more objects than that, but you don't need to include them unless you're specifically calling them out when you're walking through the business process, which I don't think you would. You'd be just saying, I'm going to use DocuGen and DocuSign here with an envelope and recipients. Okay.
Now the data migration artifacts, I found that I'm still lacking something. So the artifact, first of all, I'm not drawing it as fast as my governance artifact, and I can practice that. Another thing is that with my governance artifacts, I'm talking from the requirement, only using governance artifact using as a reference point, so that I'm covering the requirement one by one. With data migration, I'm not doing that. So do you draw a data migration artifact, or you just talk through the requirement over there?
Again, this is another area similar to the governance artifacts, where I would say you've got to think about what it is that what is important about that artifact that you get across.
Okay.
Okay,
Gotcha.
and it's that you need to focus on. And again, that's that will help you to streamline your time management as well. Because again, you know, if you take a very standard model and you draw that model and then try and adapt it, chances are it's going to be very detailed and it's going to be hard to adapt it. But if you take a diagram that is based on principles, yeah, and you know you're going to have this section here that's going to cover where the data is coming from, this section here which is going to explain how you manage the data during the processing part of this, the migration, and this section here which details how you what's your plan for how that's going to be loaded in or migrated to the systems, yeah, then you've got 3 distinct areas that you can fill in that match the requirements more closely. But you know there's going to be 3 areas in your diagram.
I see. Okay, so the diagram is there to serve as the skeleton of the main areas.
Correct.
And it's all the meat should be from the specific requirements.
Yeah.
And I should be talking about those specific requirements. I got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and the same is true for the governance side of things as well. So, you know, sometimes it helps to consider different models and draw out the different models. And what you'll see is that there's commonality between them. And the bits that vary quite discreetly. So then you almost got a much like the data model, the way you approach data models, you do it in sections, or as you call it, clusters. You can do that with the COE model as well. You can do that with the branching strategy. You can do that with the release process as well.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks. Now let's come to the core of this. I think the most important idea you're giving us, the mental model of the business process. Do you? I'm sure you have practiced drawing those when you are preparing. But do you use that? Do you draw a mental model diagram in the review board, or you do not need that anymore?
Did I? I'm trying to remember whether I did it for the actual review board. I think I did, but when I started my journey, I tried to draw it, but I was taking far too much time doing it. Okay, so then I stopped doing it. Then about halfway through, I realized I was missing it. That became a problem. So I started drawing it again, and it really helped to again sort of get into that habit of recognizing what the model was, sort of formulating a picture in my head, and then using that throughout my presentation as a reference. Then I stopped doing it when I was doing mock after mock after mock, because I was really sort of constraining the time that I had available to do the prep for each mock, and that was deliberate, so that I was able to do things quickly. But by trying to do things quickly, I felt I didn't have time, whilst I was still mentally formulating those models for each mock. I didn't have time to draw it. So you know, it just sort of exercised that muscle, the muscle in the mind to keep doing it mentally, you know, in my mind. And then when it came to the review board, because I was doing that quickly, I actually found it really easy to draw it on paper, because it was just dumping what I had in my head onto paper, and I had time to do it now because I'd practiced doing it so much.
Gotcha.
You know,
now, would you mind to find one of your?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I will find 1 or 2, and I will share them. You know, in the session I do on artifacts.
Okay, I do think this is the most important point, at least for me, because of my weakness in understanding the how the business is done in the real world. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Sam, I think an example will help us a lot. I really appreciate it. What the reason I'm thinking of applying mental model is if I do not formulate the model upfront, 1 hour or 2 hours into the work, I may find something, some key requirement, changing my entire solution.
Yep.
And messing up my entire solution, right? So
yep.
This is a very good point, actually, that mental model, creating the model, keeping every requirement in mind well in advance upfront is an important suggestion.
But just be careful, because you're saying every requirement in mind. It really isn't that. I think you've got to be careful with that. The what it is actually a high level interaction and process, right? So I'm trying to find one right now, so I remember I did one for what was it called? Okay, it's quite a complicated one, but yeah, let me just check this one. So this one is universal health bit, perhaps.
Are you sharing screen?
No, I've got a piece of paper in front of me that I'm going to try and take a photo of.
Thank you. There's no hurry. Yeah, you can share that later in the.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll share it in the
Slack.
Yeah,
that's where we can. We'll see. Thank you so much.
Sam, this is Amit. One quick question: when you said that you started drawing it on paper first, and then it became like a muscle memory to
yes.
Think in those terms, so you didn't need to create it all the time, right? Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it was intentional that I stopped. It was just because in the run up to the exam, I started sort of challenging myself to do things quicker in less time. So it became just difficult to try and do it in the time. But because I'd been drawing it so much for different scenarios, it became easier to sort of picture what I would have drawn if I was drawing it, if that makes sense.
Yep, totally. It became like a habit, right? So when you read through the scenario, you are anyways drawing it in your mind and linking everything together.
Yeah.
Because I think the problem many of us has, I do, is that I am not thinking in those terms. I think thinking line by line, okay, 1 requirement, 2 requirement, and not tying it end to end, because I think therein lies some gaps in terms of understanding and even clearly articulating the solution, which I may have in my mind, but not, like clearly expressing it to the judges maybe, or thinking through.
Yeah, I've just found a really good example actually. The City Scooter share, actually. Let me share this one. And and I think that's really important. So it comes down to strategy. So in order to formulate that mental model, it's very difficult if your mind is occupied doing other things, right? So perhaps think about your strategy. If you are, as you go through the scenario, immediately writing things down, your brain is most probably trying to multitask by reading through the scenario, translating and assimilating information, and then you're spending, bandwidth in your thought processes about how you're actually going to write down, what are you actually writing down. There isn't any space to take a step back and consider what you're actually reading.
Yep, I agree. That's why I've suggested taking 10 minutes and just kind of reading through and getting an idea of what's going on and don't try to actually solve things right off the bat.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that takes quite a lot of discipline.
It does. It's hard.
Yeah, it is very difficult.
You have to trust. You'll have to trust that you'll remember.
That's
when
right.
you come back. Because I've even taught myself, okay, the worst case scenario is I read through it a few times and then I solution on the fly if I have to, because it will come to you as you read through it.
Yeah.
Do you highlight or you avoid highlighting either?
So you've got to mark some things that are important, but your first pass through, you want to minimize that as much as possible. That doesn't mean that you would not do it at all.
Gotcha. The most important things you can have.
The most important things that you have to come back to, or as you're reading it a second time, you might want to spend a bit more time on.
Yep.
Right.
I agree.
So Sam, you're not like solutioning at the first pass. You're just trying to build that mental model, understanding everything which is given in as part of the scenario. So it's easier to tie things back. And then when you go through it probably the second time, you start solutioning it, and then it's easier for you to build that solution because you have the mental model in mind already.
Yeah, you recognize the model, you recognize the part of the model that that you had read the first time or you'd formulated the first time round, right? So it becomes familiar, and just bear in mind as well, just going back to the storytelling idea, I mean, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The reason I'm able to talk about this is because I went through it multiple times, right? I went through this difficulty and this challenge multiple times, and so I remember it. The same is true with the scenario. If you read it through first time and you formulate a mental model, the second time through, you will recognize parts of that mental model that you formulated the first time round, which when you run through it a second time, you become more familiar with the process. You might add like elements into that mental model that you didn't incorporate the first time round, right? Which means ultimately when you get to the presentation, you will have iterated consciously or subconsciously on that mental model probably 2 or 3 times, which means when you're talking through and explaining the story in the presentation, you're talking in that mental model way. So it has a logical flow, it has a story to it already. Does that make sense?
Yep, that is exactly what I think too.
So quick question, Sam, would you include in the mind model the what or also the how as well?
So let me just save this and see if I can get it over to you guys.
Because I'm thinking the moment I start thinking about the how, I'm already solutionizing.
Yeah.
And I can get stuck with it.
Yeah. How can I get this?
And Sam, when you were drawing the model, not as a mental model, but drawing it on the paper, was it when you're reading it the first time that you're starting to like put those boxes around the flow and the model, and then kind of reading it again more from a missing pointers, and then probably starting to solution a bit?
So let me share with you the model. Wait for it to come through. Okay. How can I? Bear with me a minute while I do this. Okay. Share my screen. So can you see that at all?
Yeah.
So it's not complicated. Is the idea behind it?
Oh, very high level.
Yeah, very high level, but it tells you what is who is interacting with what, how, and at what point. Okay, so even if during Q&A, you get a question which is, okay, well, how do we email the geolocation data? Well, hang on, the geolocation data isn't, accessible via email. It's coming from the scooter and going into scooter tracking. I can look at this mental model and I can sort of justify any choices or technical decisions that I've made because I already have understood and have an articulation of how that's supposed to, how that process works.
And those are the kinds of
Oh.
questions I love to ask in Q&A that are the hardest to answer if you're only thinking about things from a technical standpoint.
Yeah.
Really hard.
So this is like a storytelling using the sketch notes that we
Correct.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
So you could replace nodes in this mental model with systems. I've got payment gateway here. So you can see how I can then have some of these elements represented in my system landscape: the finance system, the scooter tracking system, the payment gateway. If they've got mail exchange, mobile, these are all parts of the system landscape. But I've also got things like the GPS or geolocation data. I've got some form of reservation up here, and this is all referring to the data model, the scooter, the payment. So it's not an artifact that I would use or present in the presentation, but it's one that I would refer to in order to tell the story or to answer questions, because I've understood how it works using the model. Does that make sense?
Yep.
This is great. This is, I think this is an art to draw a model which is simple and yet cover the key points of business.
And it will get stuck in your mind. Most important one.
Okay. So,
And Sam, do you? This is more like a end-to-end business process. Do you also like draw something, or from a mental model standpoint, have something from a persona standpoint, like you have a manager, you have a user or a customer, playing all those portions?
So this particular model doesn't have, it only has one type of user on there, but I have other models that have multiple users. So for example, if this user here was the sales rep, and they were a regional sales rep that sat within a local sales rep that sat within a regional director or an SVP of sales hierarchy, I would put above this person, I'd put a director up in the top left with an arrow to the sales rep with a label on it that says parent or something like that, and if they were then had an overarching CEO, then I'd draw another person above them. So it's not just one user group. It sort of incorporates quite a lot. If there was a finance director, I'd draw them above the finance section here. So I know that they're the ones who would be predominantly working on the finance data and so on.
Right. And that gives you another probably artifact to understand, how the roles are working, who is reporting to whom, and all those things.
Yeah. Other relationships, correct. Yeah.
Then what I started doing is like maybe that finance person, I've been outlining like the different steps in their process, like maybe a line item in the scenario. It's like, okay, the finance person has to submit an invoice to the customer. So I'm like writing it down like in boxes to show the different things that they're doing, because then that helps me fill in, okay, this is what object supports that, and this is where an integration point happens. So it's kind of helping me fill in the details afterwards and figure out the entire flow of everything.
Yep.
it's forcing me to think about things more from the user perspective and explain things more from the user perspective.
Yeah, I'll see if I can take another photo of a different one. I'm trying to find scenarios that are publicly available rather than those that are part of coaching programs and stuff like that. So it's quite difficult. I'll find some more and I'll share them with you.
And one more question, Sam. I would have joined late. Probably you have answered it. So when you're going through the scenario or the solution architecture, you're talking more in terms of a story, right? Like connecting the dots from start to end. But one of the things I found a bit difficult, which I'm trying to go through, is how do you tie them back to the requirements mentioned in this scenario to make sure you have covered them all, right? Because some of them are spilled, let's say, in a section which is down below, and some of them are in a section which is above. But to make sure I have covered everything, is there a strategy that you followed, or is there a good way to track all that?
Yeah, Martin and I have talked about this before. The reality is it's very difficult to cover everything, right? So be comfortable with the fact that you may miss something.
Okay.
The mental model will help you to make sure that you have at least understood how the different requirements link together. I think it's a difficult one. I think there's no sort of systematic way of doing it other than just remembering that there was something earlier on in the scenario that that referred to this system or this part of the process or this user. Other than the mental model that's on the screen and how those users interact, and more importantly, typically there's a label between an arrow. There's a label on an arrow between two people explaining what it is they're actually interacting about, or the reason that they're interacting with each other. That's where the two requirements may be joined together.
Right.
Yeah. But other than that, it's really just sort of joining the dots as you're going through the scenario, and remembering that you may have read something earlier that that referred to the same thing. I don't think there's a formula or anything to that, and it's probably worth bearing in mind that every scenario is different. So they're structured in different ways. They go into different levels of granularity. So I've had scenarios where I've tried to do a mental model and there's a big gap in the model because it's not clear from the requirements how somebody interacts with that, or how that interacts with something else. It's at that point that you've got to maybe draw a line with a question mark on it to assume that something happens, or you just leave it with a gap, and when you come to that, you make some assumptions on the fly.
Right.
But I guess the main point there is that you've got to keep practicing, and you've got to become comfortable with the habit of drawing these mental models or formulating them in your mind, at least. And the value in doing it means that you understand the process, but it also helps you to understand where the gaps are. And that's just as important, because that's where you will need to make an assumption, and that's possibly where you may be questioned, because it is somewhere that other candidates may have missed or may have fallen down because they hadn't considered that. And in Q&A, they've tried to figure out how it works on the fly, and it doesn't fundamentally work. So again, the mental model helps you identify those gaps as well.
So this is the time when we can make assumptions as well, right? To connect the dots if something is not described clearly in the scenario. Yeah. Yeah, and I really like the technique of drawing question marks as well, because then it kind of helps you to solutionize for those as well. As soon as you put the question mark on the paper, you start to think about the different options you have, and it helps you to solution it.
Yep.
In regards to the previous question about how do we make sure that we don't miss anything, Tamim, in his book, he describes this technique catch-all phase, where he allocates some time at the end. Allocate some time at the end to go through everything. But I get the theory, but in practice, I never managed to execute that.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I don't think I ever got to a point where I could dedicate time at the at the end or at any point to sort of make sure I got everything. I guess one of the other things that I did do is when I was going through and handling the business process requirements, I would comment on almost every requirement. And if I saw that there was a requirement that didn't have a comment, then that would be an indicator that maybe I've missed something. But again, however you sort of figure out how you annotate, it'll be different for different people who annotate different ways. So not everybody adds comments. Some people do it in line in the document, but the principle is the same. Is that sometimes that on its own can be a good indicator where there's gaps that you may have missed a requirement or something like that.
Regarding the comments and making annotations, I would also say practice that with Google Docs, because that's way different than working with Word.
Yeah. Yeah, I've not got a lot of experience with Google Docs in a mock scenario. It came in after I passed. So.
Well, thanks a lot, Sam, for sharing. That's absolute gold.
Yep.
And yeah, I'm planning a couple more sessions. One on prep strategy, which you've talked about a little bit here as well, and artifacts. So we'll get those scheduled in.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you, Sam.
That's all right.
Thank you, Sam.
No worries.
Thank
Very
you.
much, Sam.
We look forward to your
Later.
next sessions. Just let me know when you're ready.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll do.
Thank you
All
very
right,
much.
speak to you later.
Okay.
Cheers.
Cheers,
Bye.
guys. Take care.
Bye.